The first body they found was smiling. I need you to understand what that means. Jebediah Morse, 23 years old, married 2 months prior, found at the bottom of shaft number 4 with his neck broken clean through. The cave-in had crushed his lantern, shattered his ribs, buried him under 2 tons of West Virginia coal. But his face, Lord help me, his face wore the most peaceful expression I'd ever seen on a dead man. Like he'd been looking at something beautiful right before the mountain came down on top of him. The mine foreman took one look and sent word to shut down the shaft. Told the company men it was unstable rock, bad timber, the usual explanations. But I saw his hands shaking when he signed the closure order. Ezra McKinnon had worked coal for 30 years, seen men die in ways that would turn your stomach. He'd never shut down a profitable shaft over one accident. That was February 15th, 1903. 7 more men would die in the next 3 weeks. Only 2 of us would live to see March. My name is Cornelius Wade, and I was shift foreman at the Hawk's Nest operation in Fayette County. What I'm about to tell you happened over 60 years before anyone heard the name Mothman, but I've come to believe we were the first to see what men would later fear in Point Pleasant. I've kept silent for 71 years. Watched the newspapers write about gas explosions and equipment failures. Watched the mine company bury my reports in filing cabinets. Watched the other survivor drink himself to death in a Charleston boarding house rather than live with what he knew. I'm 94 years old. Heart's failing. Doctor says I have weeks, not months. When I die, this truth dies with me. So here it is finally. What happened in the winter of 1903, when something with wings the size of barn doors came hunting in the coal fields of West Virginia. The Hawk's Nest mine sat in a hollow so deep that winter came early and stayed late. December through March, the sun never touched the bottom of that valley. We worked in perpetual twilight, the only light coming from our carbide lamps and the burning slag heap that glowed like a wound against the mountainside. It was hard country then, harder than folks today can imagine. No electricity, no automobiles, no radios, just men and mules and dynamite, tearing coal out of the mountain 1 ton at a time. We lived in company housing, tar paper shacks lined up like dominoes along the creek, 20 families packed into a space that wouldn't hold 5 houses today. The company store sold beans and bacon at prices that kept most miners in debt from cradle to grave. But coal was king, and Hawk's Nest was one of the richest veins in Fayette County. The seam ran deep and thick, black as midnight and twice as profitable. We pulled 1,200 tons a day out of that mountain, loaded it onto rail cars bound for Pittsburgh and Baltimore. Good coal, clean coal, the kind that burned hot enough to forge steel for the nation's growing cities. I was 31 that winter, married to Sarah for 8 years, with 3 children who barely knew their father's face without coal dust on it. I'd started as a trapper boy at 14, worked my way up through mule driver and shot firer to shift foreman. It was honest work, if dangerous. Every man who went underground knew the mountain could claim him. Gas explosions, cave-ins, machinery accidents. We lived with death as a constant neighbor. But what came that winter was different. What came that winter wasn't an accident of industry or the mountain's natural hazard. And what came hunting us was older than coal, older than the Cherokee who'd once walked these ridges. It was something that had been sleeping in the deep places, and our tunnels had woken it up. The first sign came on a January night, so cold the creek froze solid. I was walking the evening shift change, checking the books against the tonnage coming up in the cage elevator. The tipple, a massive wooden structure that sorted and loaded our coal, creaked in the wind like a sailing ship. Above us, the stars were sharp as ice crystals in the clear mountain air. That's when Bobby Fletcher ran up from the shaft house, breath steaming, eyes wide as saucers. "Mr. Wade," he said, voice tight with something between fear and wonder, "you need to come see this." Bobby was 19, son of a miner who died in a gas explosion 3 years prior. Good boy, reliable, not given to flights of fancy or tall tales. When Bobby Fletcher said you needed to see something, you went and looked. I followed him down the narrow gauge tracks to where the night shift was gathering around the base of the tipple. 15 men stood in a tight cluster, faces tilted upward, carbide lamps throwing dancing shadows against the wooden framework above. "There," whispered Tommy Kowalski, pointing, "on the top platform." I looked up and felt my blood turn to winter water. Something was perched on the tipple's highest point, 90 feet above the ground. In the shifting light of our lamps, I caught impressions rather than details. Enormous size, dark wings folded against its body, the suggestion of terrible height. It sat motionless as a statue, head turned in our direction. Even from that distance, I could see the eyes. 2 points of red light, steady and unblinking, studying us with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. "What in God's name is that thing?" somebody whispered. I'd grown up in these mountains, knew every bird of prey that soared the ridges, eagles, hawks, vultures, the occasional peregrine falcon. This was none of those. This was something that belonged in nightmares, not perched on industrial equipment in Fayette County, West Virginia. "Must be some kind of crane," said Frank Morrison, though his voice carried no conviction. "Big blue heron, maybe, lost its way." But herons didn't stand tall as men. Herons didn't have wingspans that blocked out stars, and herons, sure as hell, didn't have eyes that glowed like coals in the darkness. We watched it for maybe 10 minutes. None of us moved. None of us spoke above a whisper. The creature remained perfectly still, head cocked at an angle that suggested it was listening as much as watching. Around us, the usual sounds of the night shift, steam engines, rail cars, the distant echo of pickaxes in the tunnels, seemed muted, as if the very air had grown thick. Then, without warning, it moved. The wings unfolded with a sound like sailcloth snapping in a hurricane. The span was impossible, 30 feet, maybe 40. In the lamplight, I glimpsed leathery skin stretched over bone, joints that bent in ways that hurt to look at. The creature raised itself to its full height, and I realized we'd been seeing only half of it while it crouched. Standing erect, it was tall as 2 men, maybe taller. For one heart-stopping moment, it spread those wings wide and stood silhouetted against the winter sky like some ancient god of the air. Then, it launched itself upward with a single, powerful downstroke. The wind hit us like a physical blow. Carbide lamps guttered and went out. Hat flew off my head. Men staggered backward, hands raised to shield their faces from the hurricane force of those wings. The sound, Lord Jesus, the sound it made, was like nothing I'd heard before or since. Part bird cry, part steam whistle, part something else entirely. Something that made every primitive instinct in my body scream, "Run." When our lamps were relit and our hearts had stopped hammering, the thing was gone. Vanished into the darkness over the mountains as completely as if it had never been there at all. We stood in silence for a long moment, each man probably wondering if he'd dreamed the whole encounter. Finally, Frank Morrison cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "that was something." And that was all anyone said about it that night. We went back to work, loaded coal cars, checked tunnel supports, did the 1,000 small tasks that keep a mind running. But I noticed the men stayed closer together than usual, noticed how their eyes kept drifting upward to the empty tipple platform, noticed how they jumped at every creak of timber, every distant sound echoing from the mountain's depths. I should have sent word to the company office in Charleston that very night, should have filed a report, requested an investigation, maybe even shut down operations until we could figure out what we were dealing with. But what would I have written? Huge bird with glowing eyes observed perching on mining equipment. Recommend immediate evacuation. They'd have laughed me out of the state capitol if they didn't fire me outright. So I did what men do when faced with the impossible. I convinced myself it was something ordinary. A misidentification in poor light. Mass hysteria brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of winter work. Just another story to tell over whiskey on Saturday nights, the kind that would get bigger and stranger with each telling. I was wrong, of course, dead wrong, but I wouldn't learn that until 3 weeks later, when Jebediah Morse became the first to die. The accident started 2 days after the sighting. Nothing dramatic at first, just the kind of small failures that plague any mining operation. A cable snapped on the hoist system, sending an empty cage plummeting to the bottom of shaft number 3. Nobody hurt, but 3 hours lost while we rigged a replacement. Then a section of rail buckled in Tunnel 7, derailing a coal car and blocking access to our best working face. Another delay, another lost day of production. By itself, either incident would have been routine maintenance issues. Together, They felt like the beginning of a pattern. I started keeping more detailed logs, documenting every equipment failure, every accident that cost us time and tonnage. What I found made no sense from an engineering standpoint. The failures weren't random. They clustered around certain areas of the mine, specifically the deeper tunnels that stretched farthest into the mountain's heart. Shaft number 4, where we'd been driving anew heading toward what the surveyors promised was the thickest part of the coal seam. The ventilation fans that served the lowest levels kept shutting down without explanation, forcing us to evacuate workers until the air cleared. Support timbers that had been solid as bedrock suddenly developed hairline cracks that spread and widened overnight. Most troubling of all were the sounds. It started with the night shift reporting strange echoes from the abandoned sections of the mine, old workings that had been sealed off years earlier when the coal played out. Workers described hearing tapping, scraping, sometimes what sounded like massive wings beating against stone. The day shift found no evidence of intrusion, no broken seals, no disturbed rockfalls, no explanation for what the night workers claimed to hear. I went down myself to investigate, taking Bobby Fletcher and 2 other reliable men into the deepest parts of the mine. We still worked actively. 400 feet below ground, the tunnels were narrow and oppressive, carved just wide enough for men and mules to navigate. Our carbide lamps threw wild shadows on the walls, making the coal seams look like black veins in the mountain's flesh. We followed the main drift for half a mile, checking timber supports and testing the air for gas concentrations. Everything seemed normal, the mundane, dangerous normal of underground mining. Then, we reached the intersection where Tunnel 9 branched off toward the old workings. The seal was intact. Heavy timber planks nailed across the tunnel mouth, warning signs painted in red letters, danger, no entry, unsafe air. But something was wrong with the wood itself. The planks showed deep gouges, long parallel scratches that looked like nothing so much as claw marks. Fresh claw marks, the wood still pale where something had raked across it. "Animals," said Bobby, though his voice shook. "Bear, maybe, or a big cat." But what kind of animal could reach gouges 8 feet off the tunnel floor? What kind of claws could score inch-deep furrows in solid oak planking? I was examining the damaged seal more closely when the sound started. Deep in the abandoned workings, something was moving. Not the scurrying of rats or the flutter of bats. This was deliberate, methodical. The sound of something large dragging itself through narrow spaces, occasionally scraping against stone walls. We stood frozen, hardly breathing, as the sound grew closer. Whatever was back there was heading toward our position, working its way through tunnels that should have been impassable after years of cave-ins and settling. The scraping grew louder, more distinct. Now I could hear what sounded like breathing, deep, labored inhalations that echoed through the abandoned drifts. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. We waited in absolute silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. No sound came from beyond the sealed tunnel. No movement, no breathing, nothing at all. It was as if whatever had been approaching had simply vanished into the mountain's depths. "We're leaving," I said finally. "Now." Nobody argued. We walked back through those tunnels faster than was safe, our lights bobbing wildly as we hurried toward the main shaft. Behind us, the silence felt heavy and wrong, like something holding its breath until we were gone. That night, I sent a telegram to the company office in Charleston. "Recommend immediate inspection of abandoned workings, possible structural instability." It was cowardice, plain and simple. I couldn't bring myself to write what I'd really observed. The claw marks, the sounds, the sense of something vast and patient waiting in the darkness beneath our feet. The company response came back the next day. "Continue operations normal schedule. Inspection team unavailable until spring." Typical corporate penny pinching, but for once I was grateful for their indifference. An inspection would have meant questions I couldn't answer, reports I couldn't write, explanations that would sound like the ravings of a madman. So we kept working. Kept sending men into tunnels that felt increasingly wrong. Kept pretending that the accidents were natural, the sounds were imagination. The growing sense of dread that hung over the camp was just winter cabin fever. The second sighting came on February 10th, 5 days before Jebediah Morse died. I was walking home from the late shift, Sarah keeping my dinner warm as she did every night. The path from the mine to the company housing followed the creek bed, winding between slag piles and equipment sheds. Overhead, the stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, unmarred by the electric lights that would come to the region decades later. I was tired, thinking about the quotas we were falling behind, worrying about the increasing frequency of equipment failures. My boots crunched on frozen gravel, and my breath steamed in the bitter cold. Another long day in a string of long days, nothing more remarkable than that. Then I heard the sound of wings, not the flutter of nightbirds or bats, but something massive moving through the air above me. I looked up and saw it silhouetted against the stars, enormous wings beating slowly, methodically, carrying something that had no business flying through the skies over West Virginia. The creature was perhaps 200 feet above me, close enough that I could see the details of its construction with terrifying clarity. The wings weren't feathered like a bird's, but leathery like a bat's, stretched between finger-like joints that spanned 40 feet or more. The body was humanoid in shape, but wrong in proportion, too tall, too thin, joints bending in ways that made my eyes water to follow. And the head. The head was the worst part. It turned as the creature passed overhead, fixing me with those glowing red eyes that seemed to burn with their own internal fire, not reflecting light like an animal's eyes at night, but generating it, as if something furnace-hot burned behind them. For just a moment, our gazes met across the cold air between us. I felt recognition pass between us, not just the creature seeing me, but seeing into me, understanding what I was, what I feared, what I carried in the deepest parts of my mind. It knew me in ways no earthly animal ever could. Then it was past, disappearing over the ridgeline with a final sound, not quite a cry, not quite a shriek, but something that combined the worst qualities of both. A sound like metal tearing, like steam escaping under pressure, like the mountain itself screaming in pain. I stood in that frozen creek bed for I don't know how long, staring at empty sky and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole encounter. But the image was burned into my memory with perfect clarity. The impossible size, the wrong way it moved through the air, those eyes looking at me as if I were something small and temporary that it might choose to notice or ignore. When I finally made it home, Sarah took one look at my face and sat me down at the kitchen table. "What happened?" she asked, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly. Sarah was mountain-born, raised on stories of painters that screamed in the night and wild men who lived in the highest hollows. She knew when her husband had seen something beyond the ordinary run of dangers. "I don't rightly know," I said, and that was the truth. Something flying over the creek, big bird maybe, heron or something. But herons didn't fly at night. Herons didn't have wingspans that blocked out constellations, and herons sure as hell didn't look at you with intelligence that felt older than the mountains themselves. Sarah didn't push for more details, which was one of the things I loved about her. She just made sure I had hot food and strong coffee, then sat with me while I tried to process what I'd experienced. We didn't speak much that night. There wasn't much to say that would make sense of what I'd seen. 5 days later, Jebediah Morse would die with that peaceful smile on his face, and I would understand that whatever was hunting in our mountains had finally decided to take its first victim. But that night, sitting in my warm kitchen with my wife's hand on my shoulder, I still believed the danger might pass us by. I still thought we could continue working our tunnels, extracting our coal, living our lives without interference from whatever ancient thing we'd disturbed in the depths. I was wrong about that, too. The accidents were accelerating now, coming faster and with more serious consequences. What had started as equipment failures and minor cave-ins was escalating into something that threatened the entire operation. More troubling still was the pattern I was beginning to recognize in my detailed logs. Every incident occurred in or near the deeper workings. Every failure happened during the night shift, when the fewest men were underground to witness what actually went wrong. And every accident was preceded by reports of strange sounds from the abandoned sections of the mine, sounds that were growing bolder, more frequent, closer to the active workings. On February 13th, we lost our first man to what the official report would call equipment malfunction. Tommy Kowalski was operating the cutting machine in the deepest part of shaft number 4, carving coal from the seam while his partner set charges for the next day's blasting. Reliable work, routine work that Tommy had been doing for 6 years without incident. The cutting machine was a newer model, less than 2 years old, with safety features that should have prevented what happened next. According to his partner, the only witness, Tommy was guiding the machine along the coal face when it suddenly lurched forward out of control. The cutting chain bit deep into the seam, deeper than it should have been able to go, and Tommy was pulled forward with it. By the time his partner could shut down the power, Tommy was pinned against the coal face with the machine's weight crushing his chest. They brought him up still alive, barely conscious, blood frothing from his lungs. Dr. Patterson, who served all the mining camps in the county, did what he could. But Tommy's ribs were shattered, his lungs punctured, internal injuries too severe for treatment with the medical knowledge of 1903. He died 3 hours after the accident, delirious from pain and blood loss. But in his final moments, as Dr. Patterson would later tell me, Tommy kept trying to say something about wings, about something flying through the tunnels, brushing against him in the darkness. The doctor dismissed it as delirium, the confused rambling of a dying brain. I wasn't so sure. The company investigators arrived the next day to examine the cutting machine. They found nothing wrong with the equipment, no mechanical failures, no missing safety devices, no explanation for why it had suddenly surged forward with enough force to pin a grown man against solid coal. Their report concluded that Tommy must have slipped, falling against the controls and somehow disengaging the safety mechanisms. It was a lie, of course. Tommy Kowalski had been operating cutting machines since he was 16 years old. He knew the equipment better than the engineers who designed it. The idea that he would slip and disable multiple safety systems simultaneously was ludicrous. But it was an easier lie than admitting they didn't know what had gone wrong. Easier than investigating reports of strange sounds in the abandoned workings. Easier than facing the possibility that something was hunting in their profitable mine. Tommy's funeral was held on February 14th in the small Methodist church that served the mining camp. Half the town attended. Tommy had been popular, known for his quick wit and willingness to help neighbors in need. His widow, Mary, sat in the front pew with their 2 young children, accepting condolences from friends who struggled to find words for such a sudden loss. I spoke briefly about Tommy's dedication to his work, his loyalty to his fellow miners, the tragedy of a life cut short. All the usual things you say at such times. What I didn't mention was the growing certainty that his death hadn't been accidental. That something was stalking us in the depths of the mountain, something that had claimed its first victim and was just getting started. That same night, as February 14th turned into February 15th, the creature came for Jebediah Morse. Jeb was 23, newly married to a girl named Rebecca who'd come up from Beckley to work in the company store. They'd had their wedding in December, a small ceremony in the same Methodist church where we'd buried Tommy Kowalski. I'd been at their reception, watched them dance to fiddle music while the whole camp celebrated. Young love in a hard place, 2 people planning a future together. Jeb worked the graveyard shift in shaft number 4, the same section where Tommy had died the day before. He was part of the cleanup crew, removing the damaged cutting machine and preparing the workface for the next phase of mining. Dangerous work in the best of times, but Jeb was careful, methodical, exactly the kind of man you wanted handling delicate operations in tight spaces. His partner that night was an older miner named Samuel Creek, a Cherokee man who'd worked coal for 15 years. Sam was known for his ability to sense danger in the mines, gas buildups, unstable rock, timber about to fail. His people had a saying about listening to the mountain, hearing what it was trying to tell you. In all his years underground, Sam had never lost a partner to accident or cave-in. They were working together to dismantle the damaged equipment when Sam heard the sound. It came from deeper in the tunnel, beyond the range of their carbide lamps. Not the settling of rock or the creak of timber, but something moving deliberately through the darkness, something large enough that its passage disturbed the air, creating subtle drafts that made their flames flicker. Sam grabbed Jeb's arm. "We need to leave," he whispered, "now." But Jeb was young, maybe trying to prove himself after Tommy's death the day before. "Just rats," he said. "Maybe some bats. Nothing to worry about." That's when they saw the eyes. 2 points of red light in the blackness beyond their lamps, steady and unwavering, positioned too high off the tunnel floor to belong to any normal animal. The eyes seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, like coals being blown to flame, and they were moving closer. Sam dropped his tools and ran. 15 years of mining experience told him that whatever was approaching wasn't something you faced with carbide lights and hand tools. He ran for the cage elevator, shouting for Jeb to follow, his voice echoing through the tunnels behind him. Jeb hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, 3 seconds that cost him his life. Sam made it to the cage and signaled frantically for the operator to bring him up. As the elevator rose through the shaft, he could hear sounds from below, a terrible shrieking that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the rumble of falling rock, and underneath it all, something that might have been humans screaming. Then, silence. The rescue party went down 20 minutes later, Sam leading them back to where he'd left Jeb. They found him at the bottom of a fresh cave-in, 2 tons of coal and rock covering everything from his waist down. The fall had broken his neck cleanly. He would have died instantly before the weight could pin him down. But it was his face that haunted everyone who saw him. Peaceful, serene, wearing an expression of absolute calm. His eyes were closed, his lips curved in just the suggestion of a smile. It looked for all the world like he'd been enjoying the most beautiful dream when the mountain came down on top of him. The official report blamed the cave-in on structural instability caused by the previous day's equipment accident. Damaged timber supports, they said. Disturbed rock, fall from the cutting machine incident. Just another tragic reminder of the dangers inherent in mining operations. But Sam Creek knew better. Sam had seen those red eyes in the darkness, heard the shriek that came from no earthly throat. When the investigators pressed him for details, he just shook his head and walked away. 2 days later, he quit the mine and moved back to the reservation in North Carolina. Never worked underground again. Before he left, Sam sought me out in the mine office. He stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, looking like he was wrestling with something he didn't want to say. "Mr. Wade," he said finally, "my grandfather told stories about the old days before the mining started. Things that lived in the deep caves, things that didn't like to be disturbed." I looked up from the paperwork I'd been pretending to read. "What kind of things, Sam?" "Flying things. Things with wings and fire for eyes." He said they were old when the Cherokee first came to these mountains, old and powerful and best left alone. Sam shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He said if you saw one, it meant the earth itself was angry about something, angry enough to send its guardians to set things right. "Superstition," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Sam said, "but Jeb Morse is still dead, and I don't think it's going to stop with him." He was right, of course. Over the next week and a half, as February crawled toward March, 4 more men would die in ways the official reports would call accidental, but which followed the same impossible pattern. Each death occurred in the deeper workings. Each was preceded by strange sounds from the abandoned sections. Each victim was found with that same peaceful expression, as if they'd seen something beautiful in the moment before they died. And always, always, there were the eyes in the darkness, red lights moving through tunnels where no lights should be, watching us from places we couldn't reach, studying us with an intelligence that predated human civilization in these mountains. The thing we'd woken up was hunting now, taking men one by one, and I was beginning to understand that our mining operation had become something else entirely. We'd become prey. The 4th death came 3 days after Jebediah Morse, Frank Morrison, the same Frank who'd tried to explain away our first sighting as a lost heron. He was found in Tunnel 7, crushed beneath a support beam that had somehow twisted free from its moorings. The beam was solid oak, 12 inches square, anchored with iron bolts that would have required a team of men and proper equipment to remove. Frank was found alone at the end of his shift, that same peaceful smile gracing his features. His carbide lamp was still burning beside him, the flame steady and bright, as if whatever had killed him had been careful not to disturb the light. The 5th was Bobby Fletcher, the boy who'd first called me to witness that thing perched on the tipple, found at the bottom of the main shaft after the cage cables somehow snapped simultaneously. All 4 of them, each rated to carry 10 times the weight of one young miner. Bobby's body showed no signs of trauma from the fall. He looked like he was sleeping. By then, the surviving miners were talking about leaving. Wives were packing belongings they could carry, making plans to head south to the textile mills or north to the steel foundries. The mine was cursed, they said, haunted. No amount of coal pay was worth dying with a smile on your face. I should have ordered the evacuation myself, should have shut down the entire operation and sent everyone to safety. But I was caught between the company's demands for production and my own growing certainty that whatever hunted in our tunnels wouldn't be satisfied with just 5 deaths. The 6th victim was old Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian immigrant who'd worked coal in 3 different states. He'd survived gas explosions, flooding, rock falls that killed younger men around him. If anyone could have avoided whatever was hunting us, it should have been Henrik. They found him in the equipment shed, apparently crushed by a coal car that had somehow rolled off its tracks and pinned him against the wall. But the tracks showed no signs of disturbance, no explanation for how a stationary car could have gained enough momentum to kill a man. And Henrik's face wore that same expression of profound peace, as if he'd welcomed whatever came for him. The 7th death was different. The pattern broke. It was young William Tate, 16 years old, working his first month in the mines to help support his widowed mother. He was hauling coal cars in the upper levels, well away from the deep workings where the other deaths had occurred. Safe work in the safest part of the mine. But when William didn't return to the surface at shift change, we found him in Tunnel 2, with his neck broken and that terrible, beautiful smile on his face. And for the first time, we found something else. Scratched into the coal wall above his body, carved deep enough that they'd still be visible decades later, were symbols. Not letters or numbers, but something older. Shapes that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift and writhe when caught in peripheral vision. Sam Creek might have understood them, but Sam was long gone by then. The symbols looked fresh, the coal dust still pale where something had carved them. Whatever had killed William Tate had taken time with his body, had marked the spot with signs that predated any human language I'd ever seen. That night, I made my decision. I was done pretending these were accidents, done filing reports that blamed equipment failures and structural instability. Whatever was hunting us had claimed 7 lives, and I wasn't going to stand by while it took more. I gathered the remaining miners in the company meeting hall, maybe 30 men out of the 50 who'd started the winter with us. I told them the truth as I understood it, about the creature on the tipple, about the eyes in the darkness, about the sounds coming from the abandoned workings, about my growing certainty that we'd disturbed something ancient and implacably hostile. Half of them walked out before I finished talking. Called me crazy, said the isolation and the deaths had turned my brain. They were probably right to leave. The ones who stayed were either too stubborn or too broke to quit a paying job, even one that was killing us systematically. "What do you want to do about it?" asked Pete Kowalski, Tommy's older brother. "We're going down," I said. "All the way down, into the abandoned workings, into the deepest parts of the mine. We're going to find whatever's hunting us, and we're going to end this." It was madness, of course. 12 men with carbide lamps and mining tools, planning to hunt something that had killed 7 of our friends without leaving so much as a footprint. But madness felt better than waiting to see who would die next. We went down at midnight on February 28th, 1903. The cage descended past the working levels, past the safety barriers, down into sections of the mine that had been sealed for years. The air grew thick and stale. Our lamps seemed dimmer, their light swallowed by the pressing darkness. At the bottom of shaft number 4, we broke through the barriers into the old workings. The tunnels here were narrower, carved by hand in the days before mechanical cutters. They twisted and branched like veins in the mountain's body, leading deeper into passages that our maps didn't show. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile when we found the first body. Not one of our men. This was older, much older. Bones scattered across the tunnel floor, yellowed with age but still recognizably human. The skull showed massive trauma, but what chilled my blood were the scratches scored deep into the surrounding walls. The same symbols we'd found above William Tate's body, carved again and again into every surface. "Jesus Christ," whispered Pete Kowalski. "How long has this thing been killing people?" We found more bodies as we pressed deeper. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered through chambers that honeycombed the mountain's heart. Some were recent enough to show scraps of clothing, mining gear from operations that had closed years before Hawk's Nest opened. Others were older, much older, bones polished smooth by time and careful arrangement, because they were arranged, laid out in patterns around chambers that felt more like temples than mine workings. The symbols covered every wall, every ceiling, carved with obsessive precision into the living rock. And in the center of the largest chamber, we found what we'd come looking for. It was sleeping when we found it, perched on a throne carved from coal and limestone. Even at rest, it was magnificent and terrible, 15 feet tall with wings folded against its elongated body. The skin was dark as midnight, stretched tight over bones that seemed too large and numerous for any earthly anatomy. The head was almost human in shape, but wrong in proportion, dominated by those burning red eyes that opened as our lights fell across it. For a moment that lasted eternity, we stared at each other across that underground cathedral. The creature, ancient and patient and impossibly alien. 12 men with carbide lamps and tools made for cutting coal, not fighting nightmares. Then it moved. The wings unfolded with a sound like thunder, filling the chamber from wall to wall. It rose from its throne with fluid grace, head nearly touching the carved ceiling 40 feet above. Those red eyes swept across us, cataloging each face, each soul, with the same terrible intelligence I'd glimpsed that night above the creek bed. When it spoke, and God help me, it did speak. The voice echoed from every surface at once, words in no human language but somehow perfectly understood. "You have come to the deep places," it said. "You have woken the guardian of the mountain's heart. Why do you disturb the ancient's sleep?" I found my voice somehow, though it came out as barely a whisper. "You're killing our men. We want you to stop." The creature tilted its head, an almost human gesture that was more terrifying than any shriek could have been. "Your men die because they trespass in sacred places, because they tear the mountain's flesh for profit, because they have forgotten the old agreements." "What agreements?" I asked. "The compact made when your kind first came to these mountains. Take what you need from the surface, from the shallow places. Leave the deep earth undisturbed. Leave the old ways in peace." Its wings shifted, stirring air that carried the scent of limestone and ancient death. "Your machines go deeper each season. Your hunger grows beyond all reason. The mountain cries out in pain, and I answer." I thought of our operation, of the new shafts being planned, of company ambitions to extract every ton of coal from beneath Fayette County. I thought of the symbols carved above 7 dead men, markers of transgression and consequence. "We'll stop," I said. "We'll seal the deep workings, stay in the shallow mines, no more digging toward the old places." The creature studied us for what felt like hours. Its eyes moved from man to man, weighing souls, measuring the truth of promises made in desperation. Finally, it spoke again. "You speak for your nest, small foreman. But others will come, others who will not listen to warnings in the dark. Then what do you want from us?" "Remember," it said, and there was something almost sad in that inhuman voice. "When the deep machines come again, when the new tunnels reach toward sacred ground, remember what sleeps here. Remember the price of disturbing the mountain's heart." The wings folded and the creature settled back onto its throne of carved stone. Those red eyes continued to burn, but they no longer focused on us. We were dismissed, released, permitted to carry our knowledge back to the surface world. We walked out of that mountain in absolute silence, 12 men who would never be quite the same. Behind us, the ancient guardian returned to its patient vigil, waiting for the next intrusion, the next violation of agreements older than human memory. The mine closed 3 days later. Not officially. The company blamed gas buildups and structural instability, just as they'd blamed the deaths on equipment failures. But Hawk's Nest never reopened, and the deep shafts were sealed with concrete that still holds today. Of the 12 men who made that journey into the mountain's heart, most chose silence. They found work in other mines, other states, carrying their knowledge like a secret burden. A few tried to tell the story, but nobody believed tales of winged guardians and underground temples carved with inhuman symbols. Pete Kowalski lasted 6 years before he walked into the Kanawha River one winter morning, pockets full of stones. The note he left said simply, "I can't forget the eyes." 3 others drank themselves to death. 2 more died in mining accidents that might have been suicide. By 1920, only 4 of us remained alive, scattered across the country like seeds blown by a terrible wind. I'm the last one now, 94 years old, sitting in this Charleston nursing home, watching the hills where it all happened. The Hawk's Nest operation has been gone for 7 decades, but the coal companies are back, strip mining now, tearing the entire mountain apart instead of burrowing into its depths. Bigger machines, deeper cuts, hungrier appetites than we ever dreamed in 1903. Sometimes I wonder if our guardian still sleeps beneath the ruins of our old workings, if the concrete seals still hold, or if the strip mines have broken through to chambers that should remain undisturbed. I wonder if those red eyes are watching from new shadows, measuring the distance between ancient agreements and modern greed. The newspapers call it Mothman now, when people see things with wings in the darkness over West Virginia. Point Pleasant gets the fame, but we saw it first. We met it in its sacred places and learned the price of going too deep, too far, too carelessly into the mountain's secret heart. My name is Cornelius Wade. I was there when the Guardian woke. I was there when it chose mercy over vengeance, warnings over war. I pray nightly that I was the last man who ever had to stand in that terrible presence and beg for his species' forgiveness. But I fear I was only the first.